Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. It's as simple as that. On this episode, part 3 of our look into Mel Brooks' filmography, where Brooks followed his incredibly successful 1974 with two new parody films. The first, silent movie, with no surprises as to its subject matter or style, followed by High Anxiety, Brooks's Alfred Hitchcock parody. There's plenty to talk about, and it's all right here on Movie Marathon Mood, which starts right now. Hi, I'm Jesse Ghostrap, and this episode is where things are getting quite interesting and about to be even more so, in the sense that we're going to be discussing films that aren't as frequently talked about, but are very much a part of the Mel Brooks oeuvre. There was kind of no stopping Brooks in the 1970s, after Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein were such beloved hits, and while Young Frankenstein dared to be a black and white ode to early cinema, Silent Movie is in many ways even more daring. Plenty of major movies have from time to time been shot in black and white, even up into the modern era, but silent films are exceedingly rare. There are films with less dialogue, certainly, but the style of a silent film is very specific. And to be fair, the film Silent Movie is, in my opinion, kind of a confusing concept. It's one of the few things that, in a way, holds the film back for me from being as completely amazing as it could be. The actual era of silent films is full of diverse styles and genres, and part of that includes plenty of classic comedy. Silent Movie being a parody of silent movies is not a clear concept. Homage is probably more appropriate, I suppose, but even then, just calling it silent movie, it feels too simplistic. From a conceptual level, I'm not exactly sure of the target. Brooks is himself a comedy legend and sort of emulating silent comedy of, let's say, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd. It makes for some fun, even if it isn't crushing the heights of those giants, nor is it at the height of what Brooks himself can achieve. If the film has a proper target for parody or satire, it would be big corporations, sort of like Gulf and Western had recently bought Paramount, or in our modern era where Discovery purchased Warner Brothers. Too often, these big corporations make soulless decisions that aren't about the art. But while Silent Movie has fun tackling the concept of big corporations, I kind of wish the satire was even sharper. It's funny watching corporate guys worship the mighty dollar, but drama is also drawn from our main character, Mel Fun, being a reformed drunk film director. The film that Fun wants to make is a silent movie filled with the biggest stars of the era, in effort to save big picture studios from the evil corporation engulf and devour. I feel like the joke isn't quite clear in the premise. The filmmaker isn't trying to save his art from being corporatized. The most artful thing that the filmmaker is trying to do is make a silent movie, which is daring in the 1970s for certain. Brooks himself pushed this idea for real to make a silent movie, but he didn't want to go too far and also shoot it in black and white, so the film is in color. Why not make a joke in the movie that they're having to shoot it in color? That could be fun, because one of the clearest gags of the film is that Brooks is literally being allowed to make a silent movie at a major studio just by packing in some of the biggest movie stars in cameo roles. The film ends by declaring itself a true story, which, kind of true, but also it's not either, because Brooks's career hadn't been derailed. He was at the top. And also I feel like even more could have been done to push at this divide between corporate interest versus allowing creative people to do inspired work. But in all honesty, what Brooks does throughout Silent Movie is ultimately the thing I believe he set out to do, which is to have fun with a series of great gags. It's a very funny movie from start to finish. Brooks himself, a veteran of sketch comedy on your show of shows, wrote the script alongside Ron Clark, Rudy DeLuca, and Barry Levinson, all of whom were veterans of writing sketch comedy themselves. Levinson would go on to be an Oscar winning director, as well, with an absolutely awesome career. The translation of sketch comedy to a feature film has always been a tricky one, with many examples of films that don't quite work, with a handful of examples of exceptions to the rule. Silent movie, for the most part, works very well. I just believe it also falls short of clearly executing a premise. And if we're being really picky, which by all means, I would love to, there are gags that are just a bit imperfect, as when Marcel cameos. The famous mime gets a showcase for his remarkable miming skills, caught in the wind trying to answer the phone. Marceau famously gets the only spoken word in the film when he replies, no,
No!
to being in Mel Fun's silent movie. When asked what Marceau said to the offer, Fun replies that he doesn't know because he doesn't speak French. Problem is, Mel Fun was speaking French throughout his conversation with Marceau, so yes, he clearly does know at least a little bit of French. I don't want too much logic to ruin a good joke. Good logic would lead even better to a good joke. There are lots of good jokes in Silent Movie, and it would be nice if the framework was even tighter. I don't know if the writer's room of Silent Movie was as tightly wound as the one that wrote Blazing Saddles. Mel Fun, by the way, is played, of course, by Mel Brooks himself. Brooks had played some smaller parts in his earlier films, but he takes center stage here, and I think he acquits himself brilliantly. Funny, charismatic, but also dedicated to the character in a way that helps sell the drunken possibilities. Wilder didn't want Brooks to be on camera in Young Frankenstein because he believed that Brooks would take the audience out of the movie too much. Deep down, though, I believe Brooks has more range than he's always let on, and he's actually sneakily good in Silent Movie. He's joined by Marty Feldman from Young Frankenstein and Dom DeLuise from The 12 Chairs. It's an intriguing trio of pals, with Feldman and Dom DeLuise picking up Brooks to make his movie. I wouldn't quite call them a classic trio, but they're all so good and funny together that it works. Brooks brought on his old boss Sid Caesar to play the studio chief. In Brooks's autobiography, All About Me, Brooks wrote about how Caesar could have been a bigger star with an even more lasting legacy had he gone to make movies. But when that opportunity came for Caesar, the network made Caesar an offer that he couldn't refuse: keep making your show of shows on television. Beloved by people that are familiar with his work as a comedy god, it's true that Caesar isn't as well known in the larger pop culture sphere. Brooks always had so much affection for Caesar and gave him such a funny part here, which Caesar's brilliant at, all about the physical comedy. Harold Gould of The Sting plays in Gulf, while veteran of sketch comedy Ron Carey plays Devour. The pair of them funny presences of the evil corporation of the film. If there was even more plotting, I believe Gould and Carey could have played even stronger antagonists. Another veteran of television sketch comedy, Bernadette Peters, plays a woman brought on to seduce Mel Fun to distract him from making his silent movie before actually falling for him. Peters is a great performer, very funny, but this might be the weakest plotting in the whole film, leading to some okay sequences, but not being the strongest way to get into the third act. Peters could have been better utilized, honestly, as someone throughout the film, but that would require more work on the script. And this is mostly an excuse for a series of gags, which is why the semblance of a possible story doesn't feel quite right. And yes, among the cast of the film, a group of big stars of the time, starting with Burt Reynolds of Deliverance and The Longest Yard. The stars are all approached by Brooks, Feldman, and DeLuise to recruit them for the film. Reynolds is resistant but has good moments, as the trio try to sneakily get into his home to convince him to be in the movie. They sneak into his shower, for instance, and stack up on top of each other as an absurd disguise at another point. It all makes for good wacky humor. Reynolds is a terrific comic performer, as evidenced in his career, especially in films that he did after Silent Movie. James Caan of The Godfather and Brian Song is okay in his sequence of the film, if not as great as Reynolds. Caan was a terrific actor, perhaps not as suited to slapstick, but that's fine, and his sequence works well enough. Then there's Cabaret's Liza Minnelli, who is a terrific performer without really a clever sequence behind her, but it works well enough for a cameo. Brooks's wife, Anne Bancroft, of The Graduate and The Miracle Worker, makes a bigger splash with a big comedic dance sequence. And Paul Newman of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and Cool Hand Luke pops up when the trio are at a hospital. They spot Newman in a wheelchair, and they all end up in a chase sequence. Brooks uses sped up footage here, much as he did in the 12 Chairs, but I feel that this technique is more agreeable considering the tone of the movie and the sequence. Newman was famously very into racing cars, and he's a charmer in a fine sequence for the film. Cinematographer Paul Lohman of Nashville does a good job with the look of the movie, even if I still believe that it would look better in black and white. There's still a great deal of classicism in the way the film is shot, befitting the nod to early cinema. John Morris's score works really well, especially considering that there's only a literal single word of spoken dialogue in the film. John C. Howard edited the movie with Stanford C. Allen, Allen having been an assistant editor on Young Frankenstein. The film is zippy and well paced for something that is all about the gags, and without spoken dialogue to make up for any lulls. And that's just the point. Silent movie does not lull. It may not be everything that it could be conceptually, and the script could be even better developed, but it's still a really good, entertaining movie that I would give a B plus. In my first episode on Brooks, I brought up the idea of categorizing the movies as either being beginner, intermediate, or expert level for people curious about Brooks's work. I feel that Silent Movie easily fits in the intermediate category. Not a good starting point, but still well worth to watch and quite a bit of fun. I have a more difficult time, though, placing our next film, High Anxiety, but I think that it would ultimately fall in the expert category for people already very much Brooks fans. Perhaps it is worth a watch for people who are really into Alfred Hitchcock, but I still feel that it helps to already be very familiar with Brooks as well, to be very familiar with Brooks. Best if one is familiar with both, hence expert level. And that's not exactly a slight to the film, even if, yes, it fails to be as great as Young Frankenstein on its own terms. Many contemporaneous critics believed that Alfred Hitchcock was a bad target for parody since Hitchcock was already so funny and self aware, but I don't believe High Anxiety is parody as much as it is homage, and it's fun to see a comic construct made of a Hitchcock style. Of course, Hitchcock was one of the most versatile and innovative of all filmmakers, something Brooks essentially stated by pointing out that anyone who's ever made a movie owes something to Hitchcock. And with over 50 movies, there's a lot of potential ground to cover, even if the story of High Anxiety isn't lifted really from Hitchcock. I find it interesting that there are references to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, with Young Frankenstein's Cloris Leachman playing Nurse Diesel as a nod of sorts to Nurse Ratched from Cuckoo's Nest. Leachman's certainly not playing the same part, with lots of wild, uptight naughtiness, but it's still an amusing nod just the same. Writer on the film Rudy DeLuca even plays Braces, a nod to Jaws from the James Bond franchise, although it's worth pointing out that the Bond film franchise itself has plenty of nods to Hitchcock, and the Braces character works in a way that henchmen also pop up in Hitchcock. I was especially intrigued when the film made heavy reference to Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, when the comedic enlargement of a photograph is used to help exonerate our hero. Blow Up was later remade as Blow Out from Brian De Palma. De Palma is a huge Hitchcock admirer who has tons of Hitchcock references throughout his own work. That includes 1974's Phantom of the Paradise, referencing the psycho shower scene 2 years before High Anxiety, but it's not like the shower scene hasn't been referenced hundreds of times. High Anxiety might have the best parody, where our lead character, Dr. Richard Thorndike, annoys a bellboy about getting him a newspaper, causing the bellboy to deliver the paper while Thorndike is in the shower. The ink running down the drain is the best of references to the blood from Psycho. I love this sequence as something that's so cleverly set up, essentially just a gag in the middle of the story. The same is true when the film references the birds, as Thorndike just happens to find himself surrounded by birds, chased by them, and they start pooping all over him. It's the type of sequence that parody films are made for, but I do feel that the film's plot isn't fully in line with what I'd expect a Hitchcock parody to be. Don't get me wrong, because there's absolutely Hitchcock tropes in everything, especially when it comes to the wrong man being pursued. But the idea of a mental institution being at the center of everything, in this case, that institution is called the Psychoneurotic Institute for the Very, Very Nervous. That just feels like a bridge too far to me. I'd rather see a more common man caught in a story of intrigue, a big time doctor being brought in by the Institute, then being the one whose framed feels like it's too much. The film has lots of terrific sequences and plenty of style that feels like the master of suspense, but the plotting just doesn't feel like the right spirit to me. Brooks is terrific, though, as Dr. Thorndike. Funny, charismatic enough to hang the movie around. The sequence where he has to give a speech to fellow psychiatrists and someone walks in with their kids because they couldn't find a babysitter is a good one, where the psychosexual conversation has to be diluted as to not spoil the minds of the little children that are suddenly in the audience. In a way, I wish the movie did more with that sexual innuendo. Harvey Korman of Blazing Saddles has a great submissive relationship with Nurse Diesel, and I love Corman's way of manipulating patients behind Dr. Thorndike's back. If those subversions played more of a part with our main character, it could be even more effective. As is, it's funny stuff that isn't super integrated. Ron Carey has a larger part than in Silent Movie, here acting as a concierge to Brooks, and he does a good job of being a foil for Brooks to bounce off of. It might have made more sense, though, I think, to have Madeline Kahn play an even larger part and to be there in places that Carrie is. Kahn enters the story a bit late as the daughter of a patient at the Institute who she believes has mistakenly been labeled insane. She seeks the help of Brooks to unravel the truth, and they have a romantic connection that feels quickly developed. It works well enough for a silly movie, but I can also see a world in which the plot was cleaner and developed in such a way that felt even more like a Hitchcock plot. The plotting isn't bad, it just feels like it has too many convolutions and is overall a bit underdeveloped. It's more of a clothesline to hang references and gags upon, much like the same writing team did with Silent Movie. Both movies are entertaining, but they lack a certain tightness that existed in earlier Brooks scripts. High Anxiety not only kept the same writers, but other key principal players like composer John Morris, who does a fine emulation of Bernard Herrmann, while editor John C. Howard certainly keeps the pace going. Cinematographer Paul Lohman seems to be having a lot of fun with this one, the camera crashing a couple of times as it tracks into and out of scenes. I believe it's Brooks's most cinematic looking film to date, which owes a lot certainly to the emulation of the master. Since the film involves Brooks's character experiencing intense vertigo when in high places, I wanted to see the classic vertigo shot, but the style of the film overall could be pushed more. Hitchcock certainly pushed the form of cinema a lot, and there could have been room for an extended take somewhere. I don't think that's the film's biggest problem, but it's still well made. The film could have done even more, involved some popular monument in its plot somewhere, etc. Hitchcock's last film, Family Plot, came out the year before High Anxiety. Hitchcock received a special screening by Brooks of High Anxiety, and while he walked out of the screening without saying a word, he later sent Brooks some wine and a positive note. He clearly enjoyed seeing an affectionate nod to his work from a comedy master, and as a fan of both, I also had fun watching it, even if I believe it could have been much better, and I ultimately land on a solid B grade. Both Silent Movie and High Anxiety were hits at the box office and received generally positive feedback from critics, even if time has relegated both of them to a lesser seat in the Brooks pantheon. Hitchcock's still the master, but 45 years later, a parody of his work is not as hot in the pop culture. And Silent Movie certainly has its issues connecting with a big crowd in a world where Brooks hadn't just released two huge movies in the recent past. Both of them, though, I think are deserving of their time for people that are vested enough in what they have to offer. On the next episode for Brooks, though, we'll be getting into the beginning of his production company. The next two films, neither one of them directed by him or starring him. The first is the only film directed by his wife, Anne Bancroft, called Fatso and starring Dom DeLuise. The second of the movies is a film that seems to have little direct Brooks involvement outside of being released by his studio. That film is called Loose Shoes, also known as Coming Attractions, with quite a weird trajectory, and we'll talk about it. I haven't yet watched either film at this point, so I'm curious to check them out and to share my opinion on the next movie marathon mood. Until then, take care. Thanks for watching.